Hello once again everyone, welcome back to Moveset Breakdown. So, as you can see, we got an odd one today. So, we're embarking on a new series, it'll just be a two-parter, and I'm going to be breaking down the style of swordsmanship used by the Kenway family of Assassin's Creed 3 and then Black Flag. Now, if you haven't seen Moveset Breakdowns before, basically what this is I am taking the fighting styles of video game characters and I'm breaking them down and seeing what we can learn about the character and the way they fight and maybe why they fight certain ways through a fencer's lens, right? This is not a realism analysis, though sometimes, depending upon what I'm looking at, there may be some historical overlap with real fencing. So, today, like I said, we're going to be looking at the first two members of the Kenway family. That would be Haytham and Connor Kenway of Assassin's Creed 3. Now, the reason I wanted to start with them is because while we have chronological order, their grandfather came before them from Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Because he came after them release-wise, a lot of the animations that both Connor and Haytham use will be used by him, and so we could infer that maybe they kind of picked them up from, those techniques circulating, but at the same time, it's more likely that it was assets being used again and expanded upon. So I wanted to treat them more as, the game they were in as opposed to actual lineage, which works for us very well because none of them trained each other. Despite being all, three males in the same family, though I believe Haytham was somewhat trained by his father, most all of them learned to fence or fight in their own sort of separate world, right? For example, Edward Kenway, the grandfather from Black Flag, he learned to fight being a privateer and then a pirate, versus Haytham learned to fight from a classical perspective in England, and also probably on the continent, and probably learned a little bit from his father, but not necessarily a ton. And then Connor didn't learn anything from Haytham at all and never even met Edward. So we've basically got three separate fighters, but all part of the same lineage, and also all using a universal pair of tools. All of them use a sword, and all of them use a hidden blade. And as you can see, I have rigged up a sort of ghetto hidden blade using a synthetic dirk and one of my old forearm guards. Now the reason that this is important is because all of their sword work, with the exception of Edward, who uses two swords, involves the hidden blade in some way. It's actually very key to the way that they fight, so I wanted to include that as a big part of it. So let's start with Haytham Kenway. So first and foremost, Haytham is classically trained, and that's very apparent in the way that he fights. His stance in general is going to be a relatively open one. He will have the sword down by his side, or even sometimes held slightly behind him. All the officers in the game use this sort of open stance. This is so that they can reach for their firearms or generally mostly give commands, though not a particularly wonderful stance to, fight from, especially if, I've got a handguard, I can go ahead and keep it forward, but this is the, sort of easy to recognize, not just enemy using sword, but officer, right? So, he uses a generally open stance. He's not quite holding the sword behind him like the other officers do. He's got a little bit more in front of him, a slightly wider stance than a full upright, and his other hand is going to be held low or close to his body. Now, the reason that this is important is, number one, this stance gives him a lot of mobility and doesn't tell the enemy a ton about him. Where he's standing in an unguard that we're more familiar with, he is starting to give information, and this does limit me to certain planes, right? I'm very strong here, here, and here, but if something were to come from this side or hard this side, I would have to do a significant amount of adjusting. Versus, if I am standing more open, it's not particularly difficult for me to pivot to face whatever may be fighting me. And so there is credence to that. Now, another important thing to consider is that most of the time, he's not fighting against other swords. And that's a fun thing about studying this period and later periods when it comes to British military swordsmanship. Check out this new shirt I got for Christmas. Is that the majority of the time, while yes, swords absolutely fought other swords, and officers did duel each other, sailors particularly had to fight each other a lot, most of the time, if you were an officer, what you're probably using the sword against the most is bayonet. And that is what most of the time you'll be fighting against is guys wielding bayonets in the game. So that's probably what they were expecting to deal with, and his moves kind of reflect that. So by keeping an open stance, this allows him very easily to deal with thrusts coming in either side, and he has a couple different ways that he does defend against them. So first and foremost, his parries are relatively familiar to us. He will use an outside guard, he will use an inside guard, he will use a half hanger, both inside and outside, and he'll also use a low cart, so a low cart to defend himself. He actually uses this one quite a lot because it tends to lead into his whirl takeaway. Now the interesting thing about the way he parries is that he always has his left hand, which as we can see has the hidden blade in it, though he does have a hidden blade on his right as well. He always has that relatively kept close to his sword, so he's never just extending this out by itself. If, for example, an attack comes in and he chooses to parry in low cart, he will generally bring this up and his hand will be very close and open. He's always turning his hand to the outside, so that way the blade is between him and his opponent. So this is essentially using it just like you would use a parrying dagger. Normally I'd have, if I'm holding this like a dagger, I would have it pointed the same direction as my sword, generally, to then transport and defend. He's doing the same thing. He's using the blade to defend himself in case they slip around. He's still got this line covered. If he does, for example, an inside half hanger, he again still keeps it here. If he does an outside guard, his hand moves over as well. And even sometimes if you're moving around, he will raise his arm out like this. Now his blade isn't actually extended sometimes, but by having this up here, he can extend it and can use that to parry an incoming blow, as we see a couple different assassins do. So this is clearly in their playbook, and like we said, he was trained by them. So his hand is always going to be here, and were he not holding the blade, I would assume that he's looking to grab, as most times against a bayonet, you're going to have movements like defend, grab, and then deliver a cut. Most all of the takeaways involve that sort of action, so you need your hand ready to go, versus where it would normally be classically on your hip. Same idea. So he's blending those two kind of concepts in a way that utilizes this tool. Now, speaking of that tool, let's talk a little bit about the way he launches attacks and what kind of attacks he launches. So, for the most part, his footwork is relatively simple. He will keep the open stance until an attack comes in, at which point he will sometimes pass backwards, sometimes he will step into it. But once he gets that parry, he will then clear the line, usually by pushing the tip over and down if he is in low cart. If he defends like this, he will tend to just either ride right off of it, or sometimes he will expel it up. If he defends out here, he will keep it out here and usually employ this as his next attack. Here, he will again expel and then come back in. So he's always pushing the blade off, or the incoming blade, right, off to one of these four openings to give himself a straight line of attack. At which point his cuts are nothing really crazy. He has a 1 cut and a 2 cut. He tends to do relatively small footwork, so we're not seeing a full lunge like we would expect. It's going to be just 1 shoe length, and he will cut all the way through, and then he will cut back along the other line. He seems to have kind of a back and forth sort of movement, so he will come forward, come back, usually, and his hand, as you can see, just kind of stays right here for in case he needs to employ it. So if he needed to defend himself, it's very easy to follow over and double up his defensive options. Now, like I said, most of his cuts, nothing crazy. He is doing full cuts through. He's not doing the extended out, sort of almost percussive type cuts that we'd be used to. He's cutting all the way through down and then returning with another cut along the line. He will also launch out a 3. I didn't see him launch any 4s. I'm not saying he doesn't have them. He does use them in occasional executions, but for the most part it seemed to be 1s, 2s, and occasionally 3s. Now, his other attack is going to be a thrust, and his thrust is kind of interesting because, man, having this is just incredibly dangerous. What if you're scratching your nose and thunk, you're dead? But anyway, his thrusts are interesting because he doesn't thrust as we would expect. Normally when you deliver a thrust with something along these lines, you're going to be turning either into the outside guard, a thrust in 2nd, or you're going to be turning over, a thrust in 4th, right? So that's, you know, the terminology may vary depending upon what you're doing, but basically for me, who mostly learned to thrust due to Italian rapier, that'd be secunda and then quarta, right? So 2 and 4. He, however, tends to thrust in tierce, or 3rd, right? Terza, which would be just straight lined up. Now there's nothing wrong with thrusting that way. I still can defend myself quite easily, but normally you'd be interacting with their sword in some way and using that extension to then guide them off to the side with your handguard as you thrust inward. He doesn't, however. He executes what I call free thrusts. He doesn't do any action on their blade to provoke it. He will usually, for example, cut, then execute a thrust in a straight line, straight into third. So he won't turn over. He does occasionally turn his sword. One execution, he will thrust kind of upward and inward before following up with a strike with the blade. But for the most part, he's going to extend his thrust straight up, straight down. Now, when it comes to his thrusts, he is usually going to do a little bit deeper than his normal cut. So his cut would be about here. His thrust is going to be a little bit bigger, almost a lunge. Sometimes even a lunge, I would say. Depends upon whether or not you hit the target in an execution. When he does do executions, he tends to like to circle with the sword. So he will, for example, either stay in front, and there's one where he has just 4 cuts against the opponent before they drop. He has another where he will defend, launch an attack with the blade, step out, and then launch an attack into the side of them, which will keep him clear from everyone else. He'll then recover. He has one where he will come in, he'll step with, and then use that turn to push them aside. For the most part, though, he's always looking to get to his dominant side, so that means that all of his attacks are now coming from his strong side. His core is with the line, which makes a lot of sense given his background. Now, a couple other little tricks he'll do with the sword are going to be his whirls, and then he also has a nifty little short edge that I really, really like. So, his whirls, let's talk about those first. At first glance, it looks pretty weird in the way that he can just kind of twist his wrist and people's, even when they're holding bayonets on muskets, they go kind of flying out of their hands. But there is some method to the madness. So let me actually grab a bayonet trainer real quick. So, where are they? There. When it comes to his whirls, it depends upon how he exactly hits them. But if someone is holding a bayonet, generally what he'll do is he will stick the short edge right here in between their hands. So if as I'm holding this, you see how there's this gap, almost a little triangular gap. He'll stick the short edge through and end up putting pressure on the inside of the trigger hand. This will cause them to raise away as he's fighting that leverage. Then when he turns it over, the weapon is lost in this way. He's probably cutting them decently as he does this. It's not an uncommon thing to see in regards to earlier styles of fighting, especially when half swording is involved. If you can get your blade in between their arms, you can exert a lot of pressure and turn their arms in a direction that is more favorable to you. So I think that's what he's doing when he does this whirl. He's usually parrying low, feeding the tip between their arms. Then when he goes to turn over, he's causing them to lose it out to the side like that. Against swords, however, he's just doing a straight whirl. Now the whirl is a historical disarm, and it's quite a cool one. The way it works is that usually on a thrust on the inside, when that thrust is extending, you will put the point over, then you will extend hard and basically move into an outside half hanger. From their perspective, what this causes is you take the spine and then you put all the pressure onto their grip here. If you do it correctly, especially if they're coming at you, it's quite difficult to hold on to. Worst comes to worst, they're just left out of presence. In the best situation, you can pop it out of somebody's hand. So that seems to be the particular disarm he's doing. The whirl is one of those that I didn't even necessarily believe would work until I kind of got it. So it's nice to see him utilizing that. And it's a very good one for his character because it's showing just simple control of this inside line, which tends to have a bit of a, how do I just describe it? A bit of an automatic characterization with, people like Count Dooku or other saber-style fighters tend to keep that sort of upright position and very simple control, very small wrist-like actions. So, really fits well with him. Now let's talk about the hidden blade. So, that's where things get a little bit interesting because I did a little bit of reading on the wikis and some official sources. It seems as though Haytham's blade is just a normal hidden blade, so he does that, it extends out. But some of the executions he uses are ones that were clearly designed for Connor, where the blade can come out and hinge backward or even forward, so it flips out and basically turns into a normal knife. I don't think he's actually supposed to be able to do that, but I'm not sure. And for most of the ones that only he uses, it doesn't do that. It's only when he's using like group takedowns, where he's taking down more than one person, that it appears. For the most part, though, he differs from Connor in regards to the way he executes his attacks. One, he doesn't use it nearly as much as his son ends up using it. And two, the way he usually does it is going to be just a simple extension while stepping forward with his left foot. So what that would generally look like is he's standing in his open position, here comes an attack, he will defend, then he will step up and extend, just a natural pass forward. His palm will be straight up. He's usually going for the neck or the face. He doesn't tend to put a ton of shots to the body. He'll extend, and then he will simply retract, and he's back to his normal style of fighting. So it's almost to be thought of as a lunge on the other side. The other time he will use it is, like I said, there's one thrust where he will drive the blade up under someone's chin. He will then execute 2 thrusts, and that's probably the most thrusts he does with it in combination with the sword. And all it is a 1, 2, and then he's out again. He also has another one where, like I said, he transports wounds, thrusts while stepping forward into the body / the collarbone, steps out, aims the sword, replaces the blade, and then clears. So for the most part, he's not really relying on this. It's just an optional tool. He's almost using it a bit more in a defensive capacity most of the time. Now, that's pretty much the majority of his stuff, with the exception of one little added bonus, which is he has something Connor doesn't, which is this nice little cheeky short edge cut to the leg. So there exists the ability to knock enemies down, and when Haytham does it with the sword, what he will do is he will step out to the side, he'll let his tip, which is already low, go over, and he'll use the sharpened short edge to flick into, usually it's going to be the back of the knee or even the Achilles tendon, and he'll just slide it up, which causes the enemy to fall as part of pain compliance. It's really cool because it's so slick and fits his character perfectly. He'll just be moving around, that sort of general stuff. Flick, that guy's on the ground now, and he's fighting the next dude. So really, really cool to see. And his attacks on the ground are just a straightforward lunge. Nothing really to write home about. So that's pretty much Haytham's style of fighting. He's not much of a fighter. Not to say that he can't fight, but that's not really his focus. He's much more of the social sort of character, and his swordsmanship reflects that. It's refined. It's not simplistic, but it has clear links to the old world. And the few modifications he has made from standard period swordsmanship shown by the officers in the game are relatively few. It's just incorporating the hidden blade as an option that he can employ. Now, that's Haytham. Let's start talking about Connor. Connor is different in basically every single way. And what's nice about that is, one, it's cool to see that they didn't just reuse the animations, and I think there's a good character kind of insight in that regard. So, sure, they absolutely could have used the exact same animations for Connor, and it would have made sense. Connor was trained to use the sword by Achilles, who was in theory trained in basically the same way that Haytham was, would make absolute sense. But it doesn't quite work with the rest of Connor's fighting style, because a lot of players never even bought a sword for Connor. Connor's weapon is the axe. He has a tomahawk that looks awesome. And he learned to fight with that growing up. His main background would be in grappling, in theory some unarmed striking, and then axe usually used in combination with a knife, which is why his hidden blade is so unique, because it can come out and flip one way or the other to be used at either a reverse grip or a point forward grip automatically, which is nice because, anyone who's played around with, dagger here and there, they start getting really good at transitioning from sword to ice pick, sometimes even on the fly. And he does that constantly. So normally when Connor's fighting with axe and his hidden blade, which in this case we'll just refer to as a knife, when he's doing that, he's going to be holding it in the reverse grip most of the time. However, when Connor uses a sword, he flips it up into the sword grip for most of it. He will occasionally transition it into ice pick for some of the executions, but for the majority for his normal stance, he will have it in sword grip as well. Now, why I think this is unique is because what it seems to indicate is that Achilles saw what Connor already brought to the table. Here you have this guy who has been taught to fight with hand weapons from his culture. And sure, you could spend time and energy teaching him the European manner of fencing, or you could just teach him the basics of using a sword and defending against the sword and let him build upon that, which is what I think has actually been done. So let's talk a little bit about Connor using an axe. Whenever Connor uses an axe, he supplements a lot of the time with his other 3 limbs. So he will launch his first attack with the axe. And from there, either he'll put a lot of force into it, in which case it will cause the opponent to spin away, and it's very debilitating. Like, for example, he will leap into it and strike hard. He will do those standard turning cuts that we see in choreography, things like that. Moves that cause the opponent to receive a lot of force, and there's no way the axe is going to get stuck. And if it does, it's pulling that person down. The rest of his strikes are very, not necessarily hammer blows, they are aimed well, but they're very reliant on the shoulder, and they're relatively short range. Connor's axe, I think, is only about that long total, maybe a little longer, so that already brings him closer to his opponent. And since, as we know, when axes strike a target, they have a high probability of getting stuck, I think what his fighting style shows us is that he will strike the opponent with the axe. If it gets stuck, his next strike is going to be a follow-up with the blade. Usually if it's in the reverse grip, he will do something along those lines. He'll slash. He throws a lot of knees. He will hook the axe in and pull them hard into a knee strike. He will strike with just his hand, things along those lines. But what he's basically doing is, if the axe gets stuck, he supplements it with one of his other limbs before returning to the axe. So one of the things we see happen quite a bit is he'll hit again, clear, then strike with the axe again. Basically, he's always got control of the person's body, either by physically striking them to create distance, using this to grapple or stab again, or using the hook that he has created with his initial strike. So that's kind of Connor's basic fighting style when he's using the axe and knife. How does that transfer over into the sword? Well, for one, Connor doesn't cut through his opponents very much. Like I said with Haytham cuts all the way through. Connor cuts too, and he's usually cutting with basically the middle because he's used to fighting with the axe. And they probably used a lot of the same, I know they used a lot of the same axe animations and just had him use a sword with them. That's okay. Connor's still cutting just fine, but he's never going to be able to cut the blade through reliably doing that. He will strike and grievously wound, but he won't be able to recover it in the same way that Haytham does. So what he does is he strikes with it in a familiar way and then immediately will follow through with something using this dagger in a sword grip, which takes him from someone who is relatively unreliable with the sword to someone that's using 2 weapons at the same time. And it also links back to what he's already been trained to do. So that's what I think Achilles did. Is basically, here's how to cut with the sword, here's how to defend with the sword, do everything else you already know how to do. So why the sword grip is the next best question, right? And how does he use it? Well, Connor tends to use the sword like a really big knife for most of the time, and his stance reflects that. Rather than standing openly with his arm kind of up / here, he keeps a lower profile, always tends to stand left foot forward. He won't be like Haytham, who once he starts cutting is right foot forward. He will stay left foot forward, even as he attacks with the sword. Now this being in the sword grip makes a lot more sense. With the axe, he's always kind of closing in and doing things of that nature and tends to spring out of it. With the sword, he doesn't. So he's keeping this upright, and usually by keeping this slightly extended, I think what he's doing is duping a lot of opponents. They'll come in with an attack against him, and rather than him defending with this first, and then following up with the sword as you might expect from a forward position, he tends to defend himself with the sword first, and then follow up with the dagger. This is not uncommon. Now, most of his attacks with the sword actually kind of surprised me. They're mostly thrusts. Like I said, he uses it just like a big knife. He will defend, usually throw out a quick strike to upset, and then launch an extended thrust, left foot forward against the opponent, sometimes even multiple thrusts with both weapons. His cuts, like I said, relatively short range, relatively percussive, as opposed to full cuts through. And what that led to was I actually watched some footage of Connor fighting against an officer NPC, and Connor was really suffering at first. I mean, if he tries to do any of his initial attacks, his animations are just too big. One, the officers can parry very easily, and they will do that sort of retreating parry to create distance, and their attacks are much sharper, much quicker, and take a lot less time. So what Connor often ends up doing against them is they will attack along this line, probably expecting him to try and defend himself with a dagger. He'll defend with the sword and then upset with a quick attack, either from his dagger hand, or even sometimes he will use his kicks, things along those lines, to change their priority, then follow through with the sword. So overall, really interesting to see how Connor clearly got some training, but mostly wasn't going to be able to, break old habits. So he just adapted it to this new weapon, which I don't know if that was the intention. If it was, awesome. Even if it wasn't, you can totally look at it that way, and I think it adds a lot to the character. But overall, to quickly sum up them both again, Haytham, the Hidden Blade is a bonus, not something to rely on. Use it to defend in conjunction with your sword. Keep an open stance. Use good guards to defend, and then follow through with quick cuts or direct thrust. Whenever you end up close to the opponent, try to circle so that way your inside is presented, and finish them off that way. Connor. You're using both weapons in conjunction like normal. Left foot forward, nice sort of reserved sort of step. Use the sword to defend as much as possible. Upset with quick strikes with the dagger or your limbs. Just cut to hit and then follow through as normal. So that's basically the pair, and a lot of thrusts. Like, this is pointy, use as long knife. But either way, that's going to be the first part of our breakdown of the Kenways. I had a lot of fun looking up all the animations for this because I'm a big fan of Assassin's Creed 3, and then Black Flag also had a lot of really cool animations. So it'll be fun to do the grandfather and see how those animations were either modified or weren't, because they, Ubisoft tends to reuse some of those animations, especially in the Assassin's Creed games, which were at the time yearly releases. So there's going to be a little bit of that, but we can look at it from the fun perspective of, was this technique already around, or has it been modified, etc. So that'll be a lot of fun. But either way, I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown, and we'll be picking up with Edward next week. So thank you very much for watching. We'll go over some other breakdowns another time.